new documentary, The Veneer of Justice in a Kingdom of Crime. And let's just start out, give people a little bit of an overview, a summary of what this new documentary is all about.
The $64 trillion question for the last 6 or 7 years has been, why have no major banks or their executives been prosecuted? Because we have a crisis here that's a $13 trillion crisis. Really, nobody at a senior level has been prosecuted. That stands in stark contrast to the S&L crisis, which is 1% of the size of the current crisis. And yet that crisis saw 1,000 bankers, including many senior executives, go to jail. So the question is, why have there been no prosecutions? The best answer to date has been the Untouchables episode, which aired in January of 2013. And so the Veneer of Justice in a Kingdom of Crime picks up from where the Untouchables left off. So it's been over three years since the Untouchables aired, and the Untouchables created such a splash that it actually caused two congressional investigations into, what in the Sam Hill is going on here. And strangely enough, both in the mainstream media and in the alternative media, nobody tracked those investigations. And so I did that and put together a video showing what my take or my read on what happened and why there have been no prosecutions. And that's what the video seeks to do.
We know, if we go back to 2008, Iceland, for instance, they went after the bankers. They went after government officials, and they threw them in jail.
True.
Here in the United States, which when you look at your documentary, they really didn't do much.
Didn't do anything.
They kept on talking about it, but there was no real investigation. Who was stopping them from doing the investigation, and why didn't they continue down the track and actually do an investigation?
Well, ultimately, the buck stops with the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice is the only federal agency that can bring criminal prosecutions. Not the SEC, not the CFTC, none of the other regulatory bodies can bring prosecutions. It is the Department of Justice. So responsibility for that ultimately rests with the DOJ. And the reason, if you just look to the head of the DOJ in the time frame we're talking about, which is 2009 or really 2015, and look at the people at the top of the DOJ, the Attorney General was Eric Holter. He was from a law firm called Covington and Burling. If you look at Covington and Burling's clients, it includes pretty much every major global bank. And so he was already predisposed not to prosecute. The head of the criminal division, Lanny Brewer, who left shortly after the Untouchables aired, he actually announced his resignation the day after the Untouchables aired. It was that devastating a piece of journalism. He was from Covington and Burling as well. So, again, the client list. So those guys were already predisposed to not prosecute their firm's clients, frankly. But the reason they gave, essentially every reason they've given for not prosecuting, is just complete garbage. It's just a lie, and that's in large part what my latest video goes into. It just exposes their lies. That they're basically, the Department of Justice is run by the global banks, and I don't know really who's at the top of the chain. I don't know really who's calling the shots. But I can tell you that the orders to the Department of Justice come through Goldman Sachs. There is no question in my mind about that.
Something very interesting in your documentary where it says the Department of Justice, they don't investigate crimes of global banks for fear of collateral consequences. So what they're really saying is, if there's a crime and it has to deal with global banks, and there might be a fallout from the global banks, even if there is a crime, we can't touch that.
Right.
I mean, can you imagine if every criminal and every investigation was run like that? oh, wait, oh, we can't touch that murderer because if we do, that will link to something else and it will bring down the house of cards. I'm sorry, we can't do that. And that's what it sounds like they're doing.
That's exactly what they're doing, and it's absolute insanity because what they're saying is, yeah, there was a ton of criminal fraud, but we can't prosecute it. So, in other words, what are the banks going to do? They're going to go out and just commit more fraud. Moreover, by penalizing the banks financially, so you levy a $1.92 billion fine on HSBC for money laundering on behalf of drug dealers and terrorists, supposedly. How is HSBC going to make up that money? They're going to go out and commit more crimes. So the policy of the Department of Justice is totally insane because they're actually now an active catalyst for further crimes. This is going on in broad daylight. This is what blows me away. And really not that many people talk about it. I mean, it's just sort of like, well, yeah, they're just going to commit crimes and yeah, there's nothing we can do about it. It's crazy.
Do you think the bankers, maybe it was Goldman, maybe it was the central bank, maybe who knows who exactly is controlling? I mean, I talk about the central bank, but the people who are controlling everything, do you think they threaten the destruction of the economy if they went any further? And do you think that's what they meant by collateral consequences?
All right, well, there's actually two questions in there. Okay. First thing, do they threaten? Answer, yes. That comes out in the Untouchables. Ted Kaufman, the former senator, who was really interested in, like, why is the DOJ not prosecuting? And he held hearings, said on the Untouchables, when I came up there and started to investigate Wall Street, they reacted by saying, what are you doing? Why are you going after the banks? There's no crime up here. We didn't commit any crimes. Besides, we're very, very fragile. And, something could happen if you start talking about crime. So he right there, I mean, something could happen. It's sort of like, it's a very thinly veiled threat, right? It's right. Sort of like, you've got a really nice family there. It'd be a shame if something happened to them, Mm-hmm. And Lanny Brewer, the head of the criminal division in the Department of Justice back then, gave his speech to the New York City Bar Association. And he couched it a little differently, but he's saying the same thing. He said, well, I had in my conference room over the years, I had all these essentially banks come in and give presentations on how devastating, how the collateral consequences would be, in the face of an indictment. And those collateral consequences would include, the global markets would feel the effects. Again, something could happen. Now, the second part of that question is what is collateral consequences? It's sort of a term of art. It's not a term that they just started bandying about. It actually appears in the U.S. Attorney's Manual, which U.S. attorneys or prosecutors, they're the ones who are ultimately going to put on the trials and try the criminals and put them in jail. So the U.S. Attorney's Manual is a set of guidelines for U.S. prosecutors, what you have to do and what you should do. Like a best practice is here, you have to do this, you should do that. And collateral consequences actually got into the U.S. Attorney's Manual. I think it was in 1996, but it came from Eric Holter. Eric Holter wrote a memo back in the Department of Justice, almost 20 years ago, called the Holter Memo, and that's how collateral consequences got into the U.S. Attorney's Manual. Now, so what that tells you right there is that collateral consequences is the creature of the executive branch. It is not and cannot be law. Right? Law comes from Article 1, which is Congress, or Article 3, which is courts. Eric Holder in the DOJ is neither. He's Article 2. So it's not law. And that is why in the U.S. Attorney's Manual, collateral consequences is an optional consideration. It can't be mandatory. Mandatory considerations are things like, if you know about a crime, you have to prosecute it. That's mandatory. And what comes out in the hearings that were held in the wake of the Untouchables is the representative for the DOJ gets up there and lies and flips it around and says, collateral consequences is a mandatory consideration, and prosecuting crime, indictments are an optional consideration, which is a complete lie. It has things totally backwards. So now you have prosecutors being told you must tend to the health of the banks, And if you get around to it, you might prosecute, you might not. Depends on what the collateral consequences are. But this system is rigged. I mean, it's, basically the banks have co-opted the DOJ and converted it into a criminal enterprise.
Would you consider this fascism, where banks are intertwined into government at this point, and government and banks and corporations are like all intertwined right now, where we really don't have a separation at this point?
Yes.
It seems like it's all in one and they're all working together, because really, where did Eric Holder and crew, where did they go after they left their office?
They came from Covington and Burling.
Right.
They work their temp assignments, and then they go right back to Covington and Burling
and
for
they
more
got
money.
some nice paychecks.
Well, Lanny Brewer was documented to have gotten $4 million a year.
Right.
I'm sure that's higher now. God only knows what Eric Holder got. In Eric Holder's case, Covington didn't even, they held his office for him.
Right. The bankers are running the country.
They are. They are. I mean, they might have help from other people, but when you've got a control of the Justice Department, that's it. I mean, if you are in control of prosecutions, which the global bankers are in control of prosecutions, you're in control. Because what remedy do you have against criminals, other than prosecutions? The answer is you don't. So all these people talking about we need these new laws, and no, we don't need any new laws. I mean, we need to enforce the existing laws we have.
Yeah,
it's totally crazy. But the more fundamental issue that I see, and I'm actually going to move on to in a future video, is if you look at the sovereign functionality of a government. One of a sovereign function being a function that only the government can perform, that you can't perform. So things like taxation, printing money, enacting laws, interpreting laws, enforcing laws through prosecution, those are sovereign functions. And if those sovereign functions are in the hands of people who aren't in the government, you don't have a sovereign country anymore. The sovereignty of your country, the sovereignty of the U.S. is being chipped away. And it started in 1913.
Right.
So we're just, that turned out to be a thin edge of a wedge. It took 100 years, but the other functions are going too. And so what you're left with is basically, a two-tiered, feudalism, where you have global banks and global corporations at the top, and they don't play by the rules. And you have everybody else, 320 million people in the U.S. who have to abide by these rules. The rule of law is gone. The rule of law is dead. There is no more supremacy of law. I mean, that's been formally acknowledged by the Department of Justice itself, that there are different rules for global banks. And that's the system we're in. There's no rules for us. The rules are for you, the serf.
That's exactly how it seems. What do you think the banker's end game is?
I think about that, and I can't come up with an answer, because the answer is not money. They have the printing press. They can print as much money as they want. So it's control. And the question is, why is it control? They're stealing money. The bankers are stealing money from people. That's what all these crimes of fraud do. They, steal money from ordinary people or people who aren't in the club. But why? I mean, it's not because they want more money. If it was just simply wanting more money, they'd just fire up the printing press, which they've done, and hand themselves a paycheck, which they've done. It's really, the end game is not me getting more toys, it's taking away your toys, But as to why they're doing it, I don't know. I don't really care. What I care about is the people who are responsible for this. And these people are not doing their duty. That they took oaths to do these duties. They took an oath to prosecute criminals, and they didn't do it. They knowingly violated their oaths. This is going on in broad daylight. No one's talking about it.
Well, it seems like nobody in government or above the Department of Justice is even looking into it or even cares about it, because when we look at government, we see that banks, corporations, they have their hands, and actually foreign governments, they have their hands into a lot of the politicians, a lot of the government, and they orchestrate what is going on. And if someone steps out of line, they slap them back into line.
They're completely in control of Congress. I mean, Congress's approval rating is, floats around 10%. It should be zero. I mean, the entire Congress is completely corrupt. It's completely controlled. They act like Dodo the dog when it comes to anything. They just do whatever they do. Now, they do put on show. There's a lot of kabuki theater going on in Congress, but that's what it is. At the end of the day, there's theater. Every bill that comes up, like audit the Fed, at the end of the day, they don't do the right thing. Even in the investigation they conducted after the Untouchables into what is going on with the Department of Justice, who are these people who are providing you with collateral consequences opinions? Who are these regulators? That was a show investigation, but it was enough of an investigation to reveal the fact that Brewer had lied about. Oh well, we talked to regulators. Regulators are the ones who are assessing collateral consequences. And that's shown in the video. But the whole system is, you have the executive branch is in control. They're controlled by bankers. Congress, for sure, is controlled by bankers, and that leaves you with the basically the federal bench. And there are a lot of federal judges out there at the district court level, particularly, who are doing the right thing, and you see what's going on. But it's a big judiciary. I think there's 850 members of the federal judiciary, and I think there's probably, I don't know. It's not very many who sort of get it.
At this point, with the government, which is now intertwined with banks and corporations and foreign governments, where do we move from this point? Because it's not going to just improve.
Right.
We're not just going to elect someone that's going to go in there and clean house. We have a power structure in place right now where we have the government intertwined with bankers, and they're not going to let their power structure, they're not going to let someone come in and hack away at it. They're going to keep it. So no matter what happens, no matter who's elected at this point, I don't see any changes. Do you see any changes?
No.
That could be made in this power structure?
No, the only thing you can do, and I think about this a lot, I can only take responsibility for me. So what do? Well, I stopped watching television a long time ago. So I'm always sort of pushing, like, what's the next thing? What's the next thing I can cut out? What's the next thing I can do? I stopped reading mainstream, media, all of it. The only reason I have to read an article from the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal anymore is if I come across it in research. Other than that, I won't touch it because I know I'm being lied to in one way or another. Now, there's a lot of truth in those articles, but they have to put a lot of facts in there to make it plausible so you believe whatever lie it is in that article that they're selling. I don't read any more of that. And in fact, I even avoid any large organization with a lot of exposure, like these so-called alternative websites like, Huffington Post or Politico or Breitbart or all that. Forget it. Flush them all down the toilet. And I rely more and more on individual people like you and me, because I know they're telling me the truth because it's their name. It's, on the hook. They don't want to lie to you really. Now there are some, people out there who are sources of misinformation, but that's what I could do collectively. The answer, you're gonna have to have a revolution. Look, your choices collectively are either you have a revolution or you have slavery. Those are your options. That's it.
Let's just go back to 2008 for a second here, where the bankers, they were begging for money, begging the U.S. to bail them out. They received a bailout, and now we're 8 years later. Has anything really changed since 2008 to this point? Yeah,
it's gotten worse. The banks are bigger, and if you look at the real jobs data, forget the 5% unemployment. That's a statistical illusion that is achieved by hiding the unemployed in certain statistical areas. The real employment situation is reflected in the labor force participation rate. And labor force participation rate is simply the percentage of working age people who have jobs or are actively looking for jobs. And if you look at what's happened since 2008, since October 2008, you've had something like 17 or 18 million people added to the working age population. And of those people added to the working age population, I think 2.8, maybe 3% of them, no, not 3%, but maybe about a little bit over 3 million have gotten into the labor force, meaning they have jobs or are looking for jobs. So that's a big problem. In other words, you're adding all these people to the working age population, but only a tiny fraction of them, something around 18 or 20% of them are getting jobs. How long do you think that can go on? It's already gone on for 7 or 8 years, right?
Right.
But that's a quarter of a generation. Do you really think that 25% of people entering the labor force is going to work out, or 20% of the people entering? That's a disaster. So it's not going to end. And that's for the little people. For the little people, you don't get jobs. And to the extent you do get jobs, you're working at Starbucks or you're working at a tattoo shop or whatever. For the big guys, for the banks have gotten bigger. You know, what happened with them? They've actually gotten bigger since 2008. So the next disaster is going to be that much worse. They've gotten bigger and they've gotten more powerful as a result of getting bigger. And on top of that, they've had the monetary base expanded and handed to them. Basically, I think the monetary base is sitting at about $4.5 trillion. Monetary base was $900 billion going into this crisis. Where did that money go? It went into treasuries and it went into toxic mortgage-backed securities, which were totally worthless.
Do you think since that time, since the economy, we have a fiat system. We know throughout history that fiat systems, they don't last more than 40 plus years, 45 years, maybe 50 at the most. Do you think at the point of 2008, to hear the bankers, they realize that the system's going to be going down? They realize that this cannot be sustained. Do you think at that point they were preparing for what was going to happen either now, next year, or coming very soon?
You know, I don't know. I have a hard time reading intentions like that. But, 2008, the panic seemed genuine to me, but the panic was all in the declining financial prices. It was in declining stock prices. Goldman Sachs stock was plummeting and everything else was plummeting. And that's really where the panic came from. I mean, all the reasons they gave for the bailout, though, don't add up. They invented all these stories, and each and every one of the stories that they concocted to justify this, the $700 billion TARP bailout turned out to be false. But again, I don't really know what their end game is, but it is one of the big lies was this notion that certain banks are systemic, which is another way of saying too big to fail. That was a word they concocted. The notion is that you've got these dominoes in a chain, and if one bank teeters, they all teeter. Well, personally, I think that's a bunch of nonsense. But if you assume it's true, it might be true through derivatives, because banks that hold derivatives, which are simply bets, okay, they're betting on an interest rate, they're betting on whether loans will default. They have counterparties. In other words, the other side of the bet, right? So Goldman makes a bet with JP Morgan, who makes a bet with UBS, who makes a bet with Credit Suisse, who makes a bet with Deutsche Bank, right? Mm-hmm. So you've got all these. The danger now is that with the derivatives as big as they are, when a bank starts to teeter, the counterparty to the bank that's teetering has the right, before the bank goes under, to come in and attach assets. And for a bank, you say, well, what are its assets? Well, one of its assets, is deposits are really a liability, but they can grab cash out of the bank, including your deposits. When you deposit money in a bank, that's not your money anymore. Your legal status is as an unsecured creditor. And that's been true for hundreds of years. That's nothing new. The new part is that the derivatives counterparties get super senior status. They actually have, in legal terms, they have superior position to a secured creditor. They're called super secured creditors. So the unsecured creditors, like the depositors, are behind the secured creditors, and they're really behind the super secured creditors, which are the derivatives counterparties. So in the next crisis, in a way, when it happens, there won't be a bailout. There will be functionally the equivalent of a bail-in, where the banks have to come up with the money themselves to pay off their counterparties, and they're going to do that by grabbing deposits. No doubt about it.
It's funny because we hear a lot about bail-ins. We hear, we saw Cyprus where they had a bail-in. We saw out in Greece, people were very worried about the banks doing bail-ins, so they took a lot of their currency out of the bank, and we saw a lot of withdrawals. And then all of a sudden we heard the bankers talk about negative interest rates. We hear them talking about cashless societies. Well, you think we need a cashless society so they can keep the currency inside the banks. So when the bail-ins do occur, they don't have to worry about the people taking their currency outside of the bank. You think this is where they're heading?
Yeah, oh yeah, for sure, for sure. I mean, here's the idea with negative interest rates. The negative interest rates are a way to take money, right? So you put $100 in the bank and you go back to the bank, a month later, you got $99.
Right.
So who's gonna agree to that? What are you gonna do? You're gonna take $100 and instead of putting it in the bank, you're gonna put it under your mattress, right? And that's really where the push for getting cash, outlawing cash is coming from. So it really, to me, it looks like they're covering their bets. In other words, you don't know whether there's going to be a big meltdown. There probably will be, but there might not be. So you cover your bases. If there's not a meltdown, you've got negative interest rates. You can steal their money that way. If there is a meltdown, you've got derivatives, and the counterparties, start to teeter, so they're gonna steal your money out of your bank account that way. But in either case, they want as much money as possible inside the banks, and that is where that's where the push against cash is coming from, and its precursor was the push against the media and the banks. They hate gold. They hate physical gold and silver because it's real money. I mean, if you've got bars of gold and you want to get out of the country, let's say you had, I don't know, $1 million in gold, okay, physical gold, or $1 million in cash. You're not getting out of the country with $1 million in cash. They're going to see that in your luggage and be like, what? No, absolutely not. You're a money launderer or whatever. They're probably not going to let you out with the gold bars either. But what's to prevent you from taking the gold bars and melting them down into a set of golf clubs and taking a little vacation? Nothing. Be undetectable. That's real money. Cash is, it's sort of like money, but you can't, it comes in certain denominations, and there's limitations on cash those limitations are gone on gold and silver. And that's why they hate these central bankers and these bankers, the big global banks. They hate gold, they hate silver, and they hate cash too, because they can't get their fingers on it.
So anything physical at this point, they hate.
Yeah.
Because they don't want people to physically touch it, hold it, keep it from them. That's really what it comes down to.
It's control.
Yeah.
And again, it's not that they want more money. Trying to read what the intentions are. It can't be that they want more money. They have the printing press. It's that they want you to have less money. That is the only rational conclusion from the scenario we've just described.
Well, what about, I understand they have the printing press and they can create paper and ink, but again, when you look at it, it's just paper and ink. They can take that paper and ink, and it seems what they do is they destroy countries and take the paper and ink, and they trade it for real assets, real things, because they can get land, they can get gold if they want, or silver, even though they tell us it's you shouldn't have this. Ports, airports, things that have substance.
Yeah, John Perkins talks about that in Confessions of an Economic Hitman, and he really talks about it in his updated version of that. But essentially the scheme is this. Let's say that I'm the banker, and Dave, you're the guy I'm going to rob. You're the mark, okay? And you've got something I want. You've got a Cadillac. I'm like, man, I want Dave's Cadillac. I don't want him to have that Cadillac. What am I going to do? I go to you and say, hey, Dave, let's put together a business plan for you that'll show how bright and rosy your future is. We can go out based on that business plan, and we can get you a really big loan, a really huge loan, and you just pay it back. And once you start making the millions of dollars you're going to make executing this business plan, well, that's not going to happen. And the person who lends you the money knows that's not going to happen. That's why the loan is fraudulent. So, but you sign the loan papers, and in the loan papers, provision for the attachment of your asset, your Cadillac, when you default, and you will default. And that's how the game is run. In other words, the debt accumulates, it's big, the debtor can't pay it back, and then the assets start getting stripped. the other interesting thing about the money situation is if you think about what money means to a person, it's really a store. It's really a way for people to store their labor, right? You work all these years and you build up a nest egg. That's your labor. That money is your labor. And so if it's true that the central bankers and the global bankers are after your money, they're really after your labor. Again, that's real control. Right? If they can control your labor, that you're being made into a serf. But you're totally right about the debt game. And Perkins in his original book, which I think came out in 1980, was talking about how do we steal all the nice natural assets in countries like Panama and wherever else. But he has since updated that book very recently, and he says that game of fraudulent debt, of getting people into loans that they can't get out of, and having the loan agreement steal their assets, that's come home to roost in the United States, and it has come home big time.
Yeah.
It's game on now. It's serious.
For my last question, John, where do you think the economy is headed right now? The central bankers right now, they're creating currency like crazy. We have negative interest rates in Europe, Japan. The Fed increased the interest rates here in the United States. And we see the stock market fluctuating. Gold since December has gone up, like, say, $200 or so. I see retail and manufacturing all declining right now. Where do you see the economy headed at this point?
It's down at the same rate it's been going down. I mean, if you just look at the labor force participation, go on the St. Louis Fed website and look at the labor force participation rate. That you could see a graph of it from 1948, and you can see that it's been going down since 2000, since about February of 2000, it's been going down. But it really took a turn down in October 2008. And that trend line is just all bad. But I don't see that relenting. I mean, without manufacturing, you're toast.
And we see manufacturing continually declining. It's not getting better at all. And we just can't all of a sudden just switch everything around and all of a sudden manufacturing starts increasing. It's just not going to happen.
Well, that's because you can't turn a ship on a dime.
Right.
But you can start turning the wheel, and you can yank the wheel too. And I think that maybe one of the reasons we hear the mainstream media and the global bankers just baying like beagles about Donald Trump. Although, I mean, on the other hand, Trump was in favor of the bailouts. I just can't let that one go.
And I'm not taking sides, Republic, Democrat.
No.
What I see is still there's an upper structure that will still have the control. And if they're threatened, they'll just get rid of whoever they have to get rid of in the end. And I just don't see a change from the bottom up. I think we need to go to the head of the snake and cut it off and get rid of, my personal opinion is the central bank.
Yeah.
And I think we need to get rid of that, which probably intertwines with Goldman and all the other banks and all the other heads that we need just to get rid of.
That would be an excellent start, but individually, we need to start dealing with what's going on here.
Yeah.
Because Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. once said, even a dog knows the difference between being tripped over and being kicked. Mm-hmm. And I think it's time that individually we lose this illusion that what's happening is accidental. We're being kicked, and we're being kicked to death.
I agree with you. Hey, John, once again, let everyone know how people can see your work.
If you just go onto Google and, Google Veneer of Justice or, Best Evidence or John Titus, you'll get a hit pretty fast.